Chapter 1. To be a slave. To be a slave, to be owned by another person as a car, house, or table is owned. To live as a piece of property that could be sold, a child sold from its mother, a wife from her husband. To be considered not human, but a thing that plowed the fields, cut the wood, cooked the food, nursed another's child, a thing whose sole function was determined by the one who owned you. To be a slave, to know, despite the suffering and deprivation, that you were human, more human than he who said you were not human. To know joy, laughter, sorrow, and tears, and yet be considered only the equal of a table. To be a slave was to be a human being under conditions in which that humanity was denied. They were not slaves, they were people. Their condition was slavery. They who were held as slaves looked upon themselves and the servitude in which they found themselves with the eyes and minds of human beings, conscious of everything that happened to them, conscious of all that went on around them. Yet slaves are often pictured as little more than dumb, brute animals whose sole attributes were found in working, singing, and dancing. They were like children, and slavery was actually a benefit to them. This was the view of those who were not slaves. Those who were slaves tell a different story. Now that slavery is over, I don't want to be in another slavery. And if ever another come up, I wouldn't stay here. Sally Carter, Library of Congress. One day I saw the foreman slap I'm not going to say the N word, for drinking at the clipper too long. I'm sorry, at the dipper too long. The N picked up a shovel and slammed him in the head and run. Back in the slavery days, they didn't do something and run. They run before they did it because they knew that if they struck a white man, there wasn't going to be an end. In them days, they run to keep from doing something. Nowadays, they do it and then they run. Anonymous, Library of Congress. We didn't know nothing like young folks do now. We hardly knowed our names. We was cussed for so many bitches and sons of bitches and bloody bitches and blood of bitches. We never heard our names scarcely at all. First young man I went with wanted to know my initials. Why did I know about initials? You ask them 10 years old now and they'll tell you. That was after the war. Initials. Sally Crane, Library of Congress. You want to know what they did in slavery times? They were doing just what they do now. The white folks was beating the ends, burning them and boiling them, working them and doing any other thing they wanted to do with them. Alice Johnson, Library of Congress. I was here in slavery days. I was here. When I come here, colored people didn't have their ages. The boss men had it. Anonymous, Library of Congress. They knew, and when given the opportunity, they would talk of slavery in vivid, fresh, and alive language. They had no formal education, but they had the education of day to day living, of observing people and nature, for their lives depended on such knowledge. Not all slaves had the same experience. A few were so enslaved that once slavery ended, they were sorry. I wants to see old master again anyways. I reckon maybe I'll go up and ask him what he wants me to do and he'll tell me. And if I don't know how, he'll show me how. And I try to do it to please him. And when I get it done, I want to hear him grumble like he used to and say, Charlie, you ain't got no sense, but you was a good boy. This here ain't very good, but it'll do, I reckon. Get yourself a little piece of that brown sugar, but don't let no end see you eating it. If you do, I'll whoop your black behind. That ain't the way it's going to be in heaven, I reckon. But I can't sit here and think of no way I'd better like to have it. Charlie Williams, Bakken, page 110. The few slaves like this were usually those who worked in the slave owner's house. Charlie Williams' relationship with his owner was a perverted one and is an example of the kind of pathetic relationships and people that could exist under slavery. There were some slaves whose owners were their real fathers. Many of these owners would not acknowledge their slave children. Others would, and provided that these, their slave children, were to be freed and sent to school upon the master's death. One unusual slave owner went so far as to educate his black son against slavery. My master's name was Powhatan Mitchell, and he lived at Petch, Virginia, right at the mouth of Petla River. At that time, old master had a ferry boat and 3 farms. He was a Whig who owned slaves, but was against slavery. He took me on his knee when I was about 3.5 years old and gave me his birthright. He called up an old soul that had 13 pigs, all different colors. He said, "You see them pigs there? They are all different colors, but all have the same mother, and all are brothers and sisters." Then he called up his son and said, "This boy is your brother. I am the daddy of you both. You are to call me Papa henceforth. You are to call this brother of yours not master, but brother. Never call no white man master, for all are brothers and equal. Black is good as white. So always keep courage and never back off from a white man. Treat all men alike and call all girls miss, white and black. But call all men just what they call you. Always be honest and just and upright before all men. When you finish a day's work, get money for it and never take provisions or chattel. If you need provisions or chattel, get the money and buy them. From that day to this, I called old Master Papa. I followed his instructions. I have always been honest, just, and have contended for what was rightfully mine. I have never feared no man, white nor black." Burrow Anderson, Library of Congress. The typical slave experience, however, was very different and was characterized by a vicious cruelty. Slaves were whipped for the most trifling incidents, and the whip was as often wielded by the slave owner's wife as the slave owner himself. Whippings were all administered by the plantation overseer, a poor white, who was hired to watch the slaves while they worked, to make sure that they weren't lazy about the work and didn't try to run away. On the larger plantations, a trusted slave would help the overseer, known as the driver. He was used often by the owner or the overseer to give whippings. Sometimes a slave preferred to be whipped by the slave owner because the driver would be more severe. Other drivers were more lenient. "They whipped my father because he looked at a slave they killed and cried." Roberta Manson, Library of Congress. So what we are now in day 3 of reading the Puffin Modern Classic, To Be a Slave, which is a Newbery Honor book by Julius Lester. We are now into chapter 1. And so far, I can tell you from what I've read, we have seen, I don't want to say seen, we have read and can visualize based on the words that I have just read that are the testimonies of those that survived slavery, that there were clearly good slave owners and bad slave owners. There were slaves. If you think about people, and this is probably the best context I can put it in, when you talk about people like the young kids that are kidnapped and they're groomed, and then when they get out free, they don't want to tell anyone that, "Hey, I've been kidnapped," or "This is not my real mom," or "This is not my real dad." And I don't know the psychoanalysis, but of how they react is because of that. So we can see that slaves took on that same mindset. even though their owner treated them bad, they still wanted to do something to please the owner, because possibly, and this is me giving my thoughts or my commentary on this book as I read it, possibly they thought, this is what I was created for, to serve. And I'm going to serve in every capacity. And if someone does me wrong while I'm serving, they have to take that up with God, because we heard the slave's testimony of saying, I don't reckon heaven will be like this. So moving forward, one day while my mammy was washing her back, my sister noticed ugly disfiguring scars on it. Inquiring about them, we found, much to our amazement, that they were Mammy's relics of the now gone, if not forgotten, slave days. This was her first reference to her misery days that she had made in my presence. Of course, we all thought she was telling us a big story and we made fun of her. With eyes flashing, she stopped bathing, dried her back, and reached for the smelly old black whip that hung behind the kitchen door. Bidding us to strip down to our waist, my little mammy, with the bony bent over back, struck each of us as hard as ever she could with that black snake whip. Each stroke of the whip drew blood from our backs. Now, she said to us, you have a taste of slavery days. Frank Cooper, Library of Congress. Now, the picture that I'm going to describe to you now, and I want to go back to be sure that I give the artists of the pictures that are in the book proper acknowledgement. His name was Tom Fillings of Columbia, South Carolina. What you can see is a very large tree, and the leaves aren't very distinct, but it looks like a very large overbearing tree with a whole lot of leaves that stretches over a great magnitude. So I'm going to feel that this is possibly an oak tree. And the oak tree in the background, you can see what appears to be possibly the land that the slaves had to work. And I can't tell if the slaves are there still working in the field, or if the slaves were meant to be right here to witness what is happening at the tree. So on the tree, it's showing a black man with his hands and arms lifted up around the tree and then tied to the tree. His shirt is ripped off and hanging by his waist. His pants are still on. And then you can see what appears to be a white man with the whip, and you can kind of see the movement he tried to create from the whip, as to show that the whip was going back and forth to hit the person in the back and then coming back to him. So you can see that movement. So that's the picture, the drawing that is on page 34 of the book. Moving forward. Anytime old master got a slave that been cutting up or something, he tell Gabe to give that slave a lashing. Sometime he come down to the barn to watch it, but most time he just sat on the porch and listened to the blows. Old Gabe didn't like that whipping business, but couldn't help himself. When master was there, he would lay it on because he had to. But when old master wasn't, he never would beat them slaves. Would tie the slave up to one post and lash another one. Of course, the slave would scream and yell to satisfy master, but he wasn't getting no lashing. After a while, Gabe would come out the barn and ask master if that was enough. Sure, that's plenty, say master. Once old Gabe was beating the post so hard and the slave was yelling, so the master called out to Gabe, quit biting that end, Gabe. What you trying to do, kill him? Slave come running out screaming with berry wine rubbed all over his back, and master told Gabe if he didn't stop beating his slave so hard, he gonna get a lashing himself. Wes Turner, The Negro in Virginia, page 156. During my 8 years experience as a driver, I learned to handle the whip with marvelous dexterity and precision, throwing the lash within a hair's breadth of the back, the ear, the nose, without, however, touching either of them. If Epps was observed at a distance, or we had reason to apprehend, he was sneaking somewhere in the vicinity. I could commence plying the lash vigorously, when, according to arrangement, they would squirm and screech as if in agony, although not one of them had in fact been even grazed. Patsy would take occasion, if he made his appearance presently, to mumble in his hearing some complaints that Platt, Northup's slave name, was lashing them the whole time, and Uncle Abram, with an appearance of honesty peculiar to himself, would declare roundly, I had just whipped them worse than General Jackson whipped the enemy at New Orleans. Northup, pages 226 to 227. My master used to throw me in a bucking with me. He would put my hands together and tie them. Then he would strip me naked. Then would make me squat down. Then he would run a stick through behind my knees and in front of my elbows. My knee was up against my chest. My hands was tied together just in front of my shins. The stick between my arms and my knees held me in a squat. That's what they call a buck. You couldn't stand up and you couldn't get your feet out. You couldn't do nothing but just squat there and take what he put on. You couldn't move no way at all. Just try to. You just fall over on one side and have to stay there till you were turned over by him. He would whoop me on one side till that was sore and full of blood, and then he would whoop me on the other side till that was all tore up. I got a scar big as the place my old mistress hit me. She took a bullwhip once. The bullwhip had a piece of iron in the handle of it, and she got mad. She was so mad she took the whip and hit me over the head with the butt end of it, and the blood flew. It ran all down my back and dripped off my heels. Ella Wilson, Library of Congress. Because the slaves were considered property, they were often ordered to do things that were not directly related to their work. If they refused, the consequences were meted out and described above. The story related below was not an uncommon one in the slave South. The master would make us slaves steal from each of the slave owners. Our master would make us surround a herd of his neighbor's cattle, round them up at night, and make us slaves stay up all night long and kill and skin every one of them critters. Salt the skins down in layers in the master's cellar, and put the cattle piled ceiling high in the smokehouse so nobody could identify skinned cattle. Henry Johnson, Library of Congress. Perhaps the slave's attitude toward slavery is summed up in the last sentence of the following story. It reveals a complete understanding on the part of the narrator of what slavery was all about. And it also reveals the attitude that most slaves had toward death during slavery. The circumstances of the story are unusual, the moral of the story common. Blackshear had them take their babies, wend them to the field, and it was 2 or 3 miles from the house to the field. He didn't want them to lose time walking backward and forward nursing. They built a long trough like a great long cradle and put all these babies in it every morning when the mother come out to the field. It was set at the end of the rows under a big cottonwood tree. When they were at the other end of the row, all at once a cloud no bigger than a small pot came up and it grew fast, and it thundered and lightened as if it were coming to an end, and the rain just come down in great sheets. And when it got so they could go to other end of the field, the trough was filled with water, and every baby in it was floating around in the water drowned. They never got near a lick of labor and ne'er a red penny for any of them babies. Ida Hutchinson, Library of Congress. To the slaves, it was clear that slavery existed for 2 reasons: free labor and the money that was gotten from the fruits of that free labor and from selling slaves. A lick of labor and a red penny. Black men, black women, and black children were enslaved because it was profitable to other men. That concludes our reading today of Chapter 1 of the Puffin Modern Classic, To Be a Slave, which is a Newbery Honor book written by Julius Lester. This book was published in, I want to say it was 1968, but let me be sure I got my stuff right. Yes, 1968. So the purpose of me doing this reading is to really be sure that it's documented and understood that slavery did occur. It is absolutely factual, and it is documented by the United States of America, and the documents are held at the Library of Congress. At some point this year, and I don't know if I'll be finished with the book, halfway through the book, I plan on going to the Library of Congress to do research, to learn more about what was it really like to be a slave in the United States of America. Thank you for joining us. I hope you're enjoying the content. Please subscribe, share, and let me know your thoughts. Thank you for joining. Peace out. Love you. Bye.